Hi everyone, Hannah here from Bearsden Essentials. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to create an invisible seam for your hat. Before we get started, in order to join two knitted pieces together, or in this case to seam up a hat invisibly, you'll need to do the mattress stitch. So it's a vertical seam that can be done on either the knit side or the purl side. The key is matching two identical stitches. So for example, two knit stitches or two purl stitches together. You can replicate a ribbing, but for today, I'm going to show you just the former of how to invisibly join two knit stitches and two purl stitches to seam up your hat. This is a way to make it appear as though you've knit in the round, which is particularly useful for machine knitters or anyone who prefers to knit flat. There will be a small but noticeable ridge in the wrong side of your work or the inside of your work. First, thread your tapestry needle with the tail or the length of yarn that you're going to be using. I always leave about 3 times the length of what I'm going to need for the seam. Might be overkill, but better safe than sorry. You're going to be seaming this hat in 2 sections. The first section is going to be the brim. The second is going to be the body. So for the first 5.5 inches, we are going to be seaming up the outer portion of the brim. Then you'll turn the hat right side out so that then you can work on the body section. So for this first part, you want to lay the piece flat and then turn over the 2 sides that you're going to be seaming up. Those 2 sides, when they're facing you, the left side and the right side, the outer side facing you should be the outer portion of the brim. So whatever side that you want the outside of the brim to be should be the 2 sides that are facing you right now. Since you'll be seaming 2 knitted stitches together, find the first 2 columns of knitted stitches on the left side and the first 2 columns of knitted stitches on the right side. Go in between them and look, and you'll see that there should be a number of ladder rungs running up the work, and these bars sit between the V's of the 2 adjacent knitted stitches. This is where you're going to be threading your needle through on each side of the work. Take your needle under the very first bar at the bottom of your work and pull the yarn through. If you're working with a new piece of seaming yarn, leave about a 7-inch tail. Now go underneath the first bar between the 2 stitches on the left side of your work. Tug gently but not too tight. Go back to the right side and find the bar directly above the one that you just went through previously. Draw your needle underneath and through again. Repeat this, going through the bar directly above that first bar that you went through with your needle on the left side. And you'll repeat this all the way up until you've done about 5.5 inches of mattress stitch where you're seaming 2 knitted stitches together. Once you get the hang of seaming, then you'll see that this is actually a really straightforward technique. The biggest thing that you want to be mindful of is your tension. So as you go, I recommend giving your seam a tug every few stitches, partially because that prevents it from snagging and you not being able to pull the yarn through altogether, so especially with more textured yarn, that can make the seam a little bit more difficult to pull together. The other reason for that is this way you can also check your tension if you give it a tug every few rows. It's actually really, really gratifying in my opinion. It's kind of like when your scissors glide on wrapping paper. It feels very smooth and you get to see a preview of your finished work. So here's an example of a good time to tug. And you want to tug it so that the stitches match the other ones around it, because the whole point of this is creating an invisible seam. So if you tug too tight, then you basically buckle the seam. There is a way to fix that. Just grab both the bottom and the top of your work and give the whole piece a tug, and that'll loosen the seam up. You also don't want it to be too loose, so that way you see the thread or the yarn in between the stitches. And so it's really a matter of finding the Goldilocks tension where you play with the seam, you give it a little tug here and there, and you find what works just right for you. So as you can see with my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand, I'm holding both pieces in a way to effectively stabilize the two sides that I'm seaming up. This helps me feel like I'm controlling what I'm seaming together, and it allows my right hand to focus on finding those ladder rungs. And so your hands, it's really about learning to develop that musculature so that you feel like you're comfortably able to seam and create this invisible stitch. For me, when I am working full speed ahead, this whole hat can take me about 15 minutes to seam up, and that's with watching TV in the background or whatnot. And so you do get much more efficient at it. I'm going a little slower just so you can see each step of the process, but you really learn to be able to detect the rungs very quickly, to have the right tension with your non-dominant hand, and then to every few rows, as you see me doing here, give it a little tug to make sure the seam is coming together nicely. So now you have one continuous seam in stockinette stitch for the brim. It's time to turn it right side out and repeat for the body of the hat. Seaming purl stitch is really handy for whenever you need to seam garter stitches, or in this case, reverse stockinette stitches, which is what I am doing here. Unlike with stockinette stitches where you have the V's, a purl stitch is made up of a top portion and a bottom portion. The top curves down like a sad face and the bottom curves up like a smiley face. To seam purl stitches together, we will be seaming back and forth between sad faces and smiley faces. This is going to create the appearance of a purl stitch running across. I like to seam sad faces on the right side and smiley faces on the left side. So, starting on the right side, draw your needle under the first sad face and pull the yarn through. Then, on the left side, draw your needle underneath the first smiley face and pull through. Give it a slight tug to set yourself up for success without buckling the seam. Whenever you tug, keep a tension that matches what the rest of the knitting appears like. Bring your tapestry needle back to the right side, find the next sad face above the first, and pull the darning needle underneath. Then, pull the darning needle through the next smiley face on the left side that sits directly above the first. You're going to repeat these steps, tugging every few stitches. Make sure you're keeping your tension even. Continue alternating from right to left, creating your seam with 2 purl stitches facing you, all the way up to the top of your hat, or to whatever the top is of the 2 pieces that you are currently seaming together. So you see that I've approached the top of the hat, and I've actually rolled up the hat brim just so you can get a preview of how awesome the finished product looks. I have rolled it up so that you can see the part of the brim that we seam together, which is now facing outwards. And it does just look, to me, it looks seamless, and it's a great way to create a finished and polished look without having a big ridge facing outwards. As you approach the top, especially for something that you're going to be cinching together, you do have to be a little bit more mindful to make sure your stitches are completely aligned with one another. You want to have the piece, this is why it's important to have the pieces completely parallel to one another so that when you reach the top like this, you're not that you don't have 3 stitches on one side left and 1 stitch on the other side. Otherwise, your hat is going to seem a little out of balance, and it's going to make cinching the crown up not as aesthetically pleasing in terms of a finished product. So once you've finished seaming and before you weave your yarn in, this is where I really encourage you to just kind of play around with what you've seamed together. Really take a look to make sure you're getting the seam so that the stitches are identical to the other ones around it. I always do a little bit of fussing to make sure that whatever my seam is matches the other stitches here. So here's me just playing around with the brim, playing around with the body so that everything matches one another, and whoever the recipient of this hat is feels like they've gotten a professionally finished hat. Speaking of which, one of the last steps, which every knitter either loves or hates, you have to make sure you're weaving in your end. For me, the best way to do this and the most secure way to do this is to actually just take the yarn and pull it through the ridge in the back a few times. So just doing a circular loop through the back and then maybe double knotting it once. But a few times through, the way that you see me doing here is enough to really secure the yarn, and you can't see it on the opposite side. And this way, you're not adding to any sort of ridge. You're just basically securing in the yarn so that it won't come through the front and it won't come undone from wear and tear. The last piece of the puzzle for those of you who have been seaming together a hat is to thread your darning needle once again, this time with the yarn that is holding all the stitches of the crown together. And so thread your darning needle, and you're going to be inserting your needle into the stitches in the same direction that the yarn is going. So for example, in this case, I am threading it in a clockwise direction because if I threaded it counterclockwise in the direction that the yarn came from, I would be taking the yarn off of all of the stitches and all of those stitches would drop. So I'm inserting my needle into most every single stitch that I can in a clockwise direction. And so the goal here is simply just to catch all of them that you can and grab enough so that you don't have a very large bump on the top, because you're effectively trying to make this hole where you can see my finger on the left hand disappear. So work your needle through as many stitches as you can, working around in the whatever the direction that your yarn is supposed to be going in so that you're not accidentally taking it off the stitches. And this requires a little finagling. You can see me really working to catch as many as possible. It's definitely easier if you just do a few at a time, but we are who we are, and I like to try and get as many stitches on my needle as possible at one time. And I'm tugging as I'm going so I can start to see how the crown cinch is starting to appear. And that way I can make sure that it has a cool aesthetic look to it. I like a little bit of a textured look to my crown so that it's got some ridges to it, but that it's not this large bump on the top of your head, so that when you lay it flat, it has a really nice shape to it. So I continue to go around because there's still a little bit of a gap in that top cinch. So I probably go around maybe 2 to 3 times. And the second and third round, I definitely catch fewer stitches. And this is for more of an aesthetic turn than a functional one. There is the functional piece of now you see that gap, almost completely disappeared. But this is also me trying to create a nice radial crown effect at the very tip top. If you're sewing a pom-pom on, like I do with a lot of my hats, I think aesthetics are a little less important at the very top. But for sorry, you just heard my dog groaning in the background. It's almost dinner time, so she's annoyed that I'm filming this while she is expecting her food. But as I get closer to the end, you see that I stop going in the consistent circular motion, and I actually just pull across once or twice in order to get it fully finished. And this is my attempt to just create a nice rounded look at the top that you can see here. And in my opinion, this is such a fun beanie to make because it has a really nice shape to it. You can do a single roll or a double roll. Once you get the crown into the shape that you want, it's just a matter of weaving in the end once again. And I like to weave it into the ridge. That way, again, I actually, in my opinion, feel like it has less of an appearance to any onlookers who roll their hat inside out to take a look. I do a double knot like you see here, just to give it an extra bit of security. And again, just looping it through the ridge a few times so that I know it won't come undone. And then once it's finished, I give it a nice clip and I can have a really short tail on it so that when I sell these, it really gives a nice professional appearance both inside and out. So I will roll the hat right side out in just a moment. But what's cool is you can see on the left is that there's not really that big of a ridge that's going to affect the wearer too much. You do have to account for it in your stitch count when you're knitting, where you have to make 2 extra stitches just so that you can make sure that your hat fits right and that those 2 stitches will eventually become seamed together and invisible. So here you have it. Here's the finished product. It double rolls. This is such a great versatile hat. It's quick and easy to make. It's super popular right now. And now you know how to create an invisible seam that doesn't show up and gives you a nice professional appearance. So here's a little bonus section. If you're a pom-pom lover like me, I will link to my how to create a pom-pom tutorial that I use my Clover pom-pom maker for. So I will link to that here as well as in the description. Make sure when you create your pom-pom that you have 4 strands of yarn to work with, because I find that this really helps anchor the hat, because that way you're putting it into the 4 quarters of your hat's crown so that you create a pom-pom that doesn't bobble too much, but that also sits nicely in place at the top of your hat. Thread your first strand of yarn and insert it about 1 inch away from dead center. Thread the second strand of yarn and insert it about a quarter distance away around the hat. I like to think of it as the fact that I'm going to be threading the 4 cardinal directions of my hat. So the first strand goes in the north, the second strand in the east, the third strand in the south, and the fourth strand in the west. These equidistant strands of yarn are going to create a really nice balance for your pom-pom so that it sits evenly on the top of your head. So when you do thread your yarn in, make sure that your left hand or your non-dominant hand is holding the strands that you've already threaded through. This can prevent the strands from popping back out when you're trying to work in the next strand of yarn that you're putting through. So once you have all 4 strands in, give the yarn a little bit of a tug so that you can see how your pom-pom is sitting. You can also do a little bit of fussing to make sure that the yarn that you've cut into the pom-pom is sitting nice and flat, so you can do a little like fussing the way you would fuss with your hair. Once you've done that, give a nice little double knot tug. Careful not to snap the yarn, especially if you're trying to tug it tight. So give it a nice tug without breaking the yarn, and then do a double knot. This will still sit flat on the top of the person's head if you've made sure to make the hat the right size. Now what you'll do is some reinforcing. So I take 2 strands, I thread them through the needle, and then I thread it through the top of the hat from one side to the other. And then I repeat it with the other 2 strands, and I thread them in the opposite direction. And this is really good to reinforce the stability of the pom-pom without making it too bulky on the top of your head. And what I mean by that is you don't want this bump to be irritating folks on the top of their head. So you only have to do this once. It is, again, you see me having to really work my yarn through because it's pretty thick at this point up top with the pom-pom. I like a really dense pom-pom. And then I just do a double knot here to reinforce the pom-pom and to make sure that it's going to be nice and snug. And like if a kid were wearing this hat, then I do an extra knot just to make sure that they can't undo it. I've definitely had some kids who buy my hats and they're like, I took the pom-pom off. And I have tried to build in stop gaps to make sure that that can't happen again. So now what I do is I turn the hat right side out again, and you'll see that the pom-pom is on there nice and steady. And again, I need to do a little bit of zhuzhing with the pom-pom to get it to sit nicely, and I clean up the ends because once you tie the pom-pom on, and if you're anything like me, your OCD kicks in a little bit and you can be like, I need to do a little bit more pruning to make sure it's perfectly cylindrical. So this is me just making sure that it has a nice aesthetic look, double checking to make sure that the hat and the pom-pom are nice and balanced and even, because if you're selling these finished products, you really want to make sure that it has a professional look to it that someone is going to feel good about, because you do need to charge what you're worth and they need to get their money's worth. So this is a way to give it a really good professional set of final touches on it. So I'm having fun here. These are my Singer scissors. I've used a lot of different scissors over the years, but Singer is what I keep going back to just because they have such a nice sharp edge. I know I can count on them to give my pom-pom a really pretty aesthetic look. So that is done here. And this is some of my yarn confetti that you see. And what I'm just doing now is playing around with the inside to make sure that the pom-pom, because it looks a little imbalanced. So once you do a little bit of shaking and zhuzhing, you get a finished hat, which is what I have here. It's seamed up and it's ready to go for the lucky recipient. Thank you all for joining me today, knitters. I hope you found this tutorial interesting. If you have more tutorials or how-tos that you'd like to see in the future, make sure to leave me a note in the comments for other stuff that you'd like me to walk you through. And until next time, wishing you all very happy knitting and a very happy fall.